The airport was crowded, the buzz of voices and the sound of rolling suitcases almost drowning out the hum of the overhead announcements. I was supposed to be excited for the work trip ahead, but my mind was elsewhere, tangled in thoughts I couldn't shake. This wasn't where I expected to be at this point in my life. Not like this. My fingers tightened around the strap of my carry-on bag, my gaze flickering over the busy terminal. The past few months had been a blur of rush meetings, hurried decisions, and the kind of loneliness I'd gotten so used to that it no longer seemed strange. The absence of someone to call after a long day, to share moments of joy and frustration, had become normal. But even in the humdrum of the everyday, there were moments that stood out. Moments like the one I was about to have as I moved toward the gate. I caught a glimpse of her. She was standing near the coffee shop, casually leaning against the counter, her back straight but relaxed, the kind of poised confidence that made her stand out without trying. Her hair was pulled into a messy bun, but the few strands that escaped framed her face in the most enticing way. I wasn't sure if she was just someone I'd seen before or if it was something about her presence that caught my attention, but I felt that undeniable pull. Her eyes met mine for a second, just a second, but long enough for a small, inexplicable flutter in my chest. I didn't look away. She did. Maybe it was just the tiredness of travel or my overactive imagination, but I could have sworn there was something about her that spoke directly to me. It wasn't a romantic feeling, not yet. But there was a recognition there, as if we both understood the weight of unspoken things, of invisible threads connecting strangers in ways that couldn't be explained. I turned toward my gate, shaking off the brief moment of distraction. I had enough on my plate, enough to distract me without diving into whatever this was. The boarding call came too soon, but I shuffled toward the line, still thinking about her, still feeling the strange tingle of something unspoken in the air between us. I couldn't quite name it, and maybe that was part of the intrigue. I settled into my seat on the plane, the quiet hum of the engines giving me a strange sense of peace. My thoughts drifted back to the last few years, the quiet, lonely moments that had become my life since I had lost touch with the one person I thought I could trust. Work had become my escape. But even as I busied myself with projects, there was a gap in my life, one I had yet to fill. The seatbelt sign flickered, and the plane began to taxi down the runway. I glanced out the window, the city skyline fading behind me, and sighed. Maybe it was time to let go of some of the past. Maybe it was time to face the things I hadn't allowed myself to feel. The flight felt like it took hours, though in reality, it wasn't that long. When the plane touched down, I felt a sense of relief, but also a strange knot in my stomach. As I made my way through the airport, I glanced around, my eyes searching for something, anything, to distract me from the unease that had settled over me. That was when I saw her again. She was standing by the baggage claim, scanning the crowd, her posture casual, but her eyes sharp and alert. I couldn't help but watch her, my breath catching when she finally noticed me. This time, she didn't look away. It felt like we were two pieces of a puzzle that had been waiting to be placed together. The tension was almost tangible, crackling in the air between us. Neither of us said anything at first, but I could see the flicker of recognition in her eyes. It was the kind of look that made my heart beat a little faster, the kind of look that promised something unspoken but undeniable. I took a step closer, drawn to her with a force I couldn't explain. Something about her, something in the way she held herself, made me want to know her, made me want to see if she was as real as the feeling swirling in my chest. I was trying to find a quiet spot at the airport to gather my thoughts, but it seemed every corner was just another scene of chaos. People were rushing to their gates, dragging luggage behind them, some with their heads buried in their phones, others scanning the displays above. I felt like I was fading into the background, just another faceless traveler in the crowd. The hotel shuttle arrived just as I had resigned myself to the noise. I made my way toward the bus, my mind still half on the strange, electric moment I had shared with her back at the gate. There was no real reason for me to be thinking about her, not when I had so much else to focus on. Yet, somehow, she kept creeping into my thoughts as I boarded the shuttle. I noticed her sitting by the window, looking out as the city whizzed by. There were empty seats all around, but I found myself walking toward her, inexplicably drawn in. I told myself it was just the usual loneliness that made me want to be near her. But I knew it was something more. She looked up as I approached, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "Hey," she said softly, her voice like a gentle breeze. "Going to the conference too?" I nodded, taking the seat next to hers. There was something magnetic about the way she spoke, the way she made the most mundane words feel like an invitation. It was as if she was offering me a piece of her world, even if just for a few moments. And in that moment, it felt like everything else around us faded away. I am. I just needed a second to breathe. I confessed, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. She tilted her head, the faintest furrow appearing on her brow. "Is it that bad?" she asked, her voice laced with a soft curiosity, but I didn't know why I was telling her this. I hardly knew her, yet for some reason the vulnerability slipped through before I could shield myself from it. "It's just been a lot. Work, travel, trying to figure things out, you know?" She nodded, her eyes softening with a knowing look. "I get it," she said, her words tinged with an emotion I couldn't quite place. "It's like everything just piles on top of you, and you're expected to keep going, but no one tells you how to breathe." Her words struck a chord deep inside me, echoing what I had been feeling for months. It was as if she could see right through the carefully constructed walls I'd put up. I hesitated, unsure of how to respond, but she didn't seem to need a reply. Instead, she leaned back in her seat, her gaze returning to the passing scenery. For a few moments, there was silence between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like a shared space, an understanding that didn't need to be spoken aloud. I caught myself glancing at her every so often, the way the light caught in her hair, the way she moved so naturally. Without pretense, I wasn't sure how long the ride took, but eventually, the shuttle pulled up to the hotel. As I stood, gathering my things, she looked at me again, her smile warmer this time. "If you're free later," she said, her voice a little quieter now, "I'll be at the bar." I usually go to unwind after days like this. You know, after a long trip. I blinked, the invitation hanging in the air between us. I knew what she was offering, an easy moment, no strings attached. A chance to talk, to connect, to let go of the pressure for just a little while. But the thought of it made my chest tighten, the familiar tug of conflict rising inside me. "I'll think about it," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. It wasn't that I wasn't tempted, because God, I was, but something about it felt too easy, too risky. She nodded, as if she understood. "I get it. No pressure." With that, she was gone, disappearing into the crowd of hotel guests. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, letting the weight of what had just happened settle in. There was a pull, an undeniable connection, but it felt like it was already teetering on the edge of something I wasn't sure I was ready for. The evening came faster than I expected. I made my way to my room, my mind racing with thoughts of her smile, the way her eyes lingered just a little too long, the way she seemed to understand more about me than anyone had in a long time. I didn't want to admit it, but the pull toward her was impossible to ignore. I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting my clothes, wondering if I should just let go of my reservations and go to the bar. But doubt crept in, as it always did. This wasn't just some casual encounter, it was something more, something deeper. And I wasn't sure if I could handle it. After a few moments of pacing back and forth in my room, I grabbed my jacket and made the decision. The worst that could happen was a drink, a conversation, and a few hours of forgetting about the rest of the world. I had nothing to lose, right? As I made my way to the bar, I tried to calm my nerves. The space was dimly lit, with jazz playing softly in the background. She was already there, sitting at the corner of the bar, a glass of wine in her hand. Her gaze flickered to me as I approached, and her smile grew just a little wider. "You came," she said, her voice like a whisper. I nodded, not trusting myself to say anything more at that moment. Instead, I sat next to her, the warmth of the bar offering a small comfort. The world felt a little quieter, a little smaller, now that I was here with her, that we didn't dive into anything heavy at first. The conversation was light, a little playful. She had this way of making everything feel effortless, like we had known each other for years instead of minutes. But underneath the surface, There was a tension that neither of us could ignore. It was in the way she leaned closer, the way her eyes softened when she looked at me. And then it happened. I wasn't sure what triggered it. Maybe it was the intimacy of the moment, or maybe it was the unspoken understanding that lingered between us. But in that instant, I found myself drawn to her in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. I reached for her hand, tentative at first, but when she didn't pull away, I found the courage to hold it. It wasn't just an accidental touch. It was deliberate, purposeful, a quiet promise, a gesture that spoke louder than words. The silence between us felt charged with something more, something I couldn't name, something I wasn't sure I could handle. But the pull was undeniable. The bar was quieter now, the hum of background conversations blending with the soft clinking of glasses. I wasn't sure how long we had been talking, but the hours seemed to slip away unnoticed, absorbed in the warmth of her presence. It was as though every word she said, every laugh that escaped her lips, was drawing me closer, filling the empty spaces I had gotten so used to over the years. Her laughter was like a melody, bright and light, something that made me smile without even realizing it. We'd exchange stories, small ones at first, trivial even. But there was something about the way she listened, the way her eyes never strayed from mine, that made me want to share more. I found myself talking about things I hadn't spoken about in years, the loss I'd never really let myself grieve, the life I had built around my work as a shield to protect me from all the things I'd feared. And she listened, truly listened. There was no judgment in her eyes, no pity, just understanding. Her fingers brushed against mine as she reached for her wine glass, a fleeting touch, but one that seemed to ignite something inside me. I barely noticed my own hand moving slightly closer to hers, but when she didn't pull away, I let myself linger there, the heat from our palms mingling. The simplicity of the touch made my heart race in a way I wasn't prepared for. "So, what's your story?" she asked, her voice softer now, more intimate, like she was sharing a secret with me. I hesitated. It felt strange to open up, to allow myself to feel something more than the routine I'd wrapped myself in for so long. I glanced at her, studying the way the dim light from the bar caught the edges of her features, making her look almost ethereal. There was something about her that made it so easy to be real, something about the way she didn't rush or push, but simply existed in the space we were creating together. "I guess my story is pretty simple," I said, though I knew I wasn't being honest. The words didn't feel right coming from my lips, but I couldn't bring myself to say the truth. The truth was too complicated, too messy. I've always been about work. I've spent my whole life focused on that. It's easier that way. Her eyes softened, as if she understood the weight behind the words I hadn't said. "I get that," she said quietly, her voice laced with something more, something like empathy, but deeper. "It's easier to lose yourself in something, anything, than to deal with what's really going on inside. Trust me, I know." There was a shared silence between us, a space that felt heavy with the truth of her words. I wanted to ask her more, to delve deeper into whatever had shaped her, but I also wanted to keep this light, keep this easy, because I was afraid. Afraid of what this connection could mean. Afraid of what it might ask of me. I took a sip of my drink to break the tension, my fingers still gently brushing against hers. I felt the warmth of her skin, the faint scent of her perfume, something soft and floral, mixing with the quiet hum of the bar around us. It was intoxicating in the simplest of ways, comforting and thrilling at once. "You know," she said, her voice low and almost teasing now, "I don't believe in easy answers, but I do believe in good company. And right now, you're the best company I've had in a long time." My chest tightened, a warmth spreading across my skin at the compliment. Her words seemed to hang in the air, settling between us, like a secret we weren't yet ready to share fully. There was an honesty to her that drew me in, a rawness I hadn't expected, but was inexplicably drawn to. "I'm glad I could be that," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady, but inside, I felt like I was unraveling. I had no idea what we were creating, but it felt real. Too real that we spent the next hour talking more, laughing more. Her sense of humor was disarming, playful in a way that made me feel like I was seeing her for the first time. But it wasn't just the laughter that got under my skin. It was the way she would look at me when I spoke, as though she could see the layers beneath the surface, as though she could see the part of me I kept hidden. I found myself drawn to her more and more with each passing minute. It was subtle at first, a glance, a shared joke, but then it became something I couldn't ignore. The way she tilted her head when she listened to me, the way her lips curved slightly when she smiled. I could feel the warmth of her body next to mine, the soft shift in her position when she leaned a little closer to hear me better, that IT wasn't just physical. It was the way she made me feel seen, in a way I hadn't let myself feel in years. Like I wasn't just another person passing through the motions of life, like I mattered in a way that was hard to put into words. But even as the connection between us deepened, a knot of unease twisted in my stomach. I could feel the tension building, silent, unnoticed, but they're all the same. There were things I wasn't saying, things I couldn't say, and the weight of those unsaid words pressed against me, threatening to burst free. I wanted to ask her about herself, about what had made her the person she was, but a voice in the back of my head told me not to. I wanted to know everything about her, but I was afraid of the answers. Afraid that it would only complicate things, make everything feel too real, too dangerous. As we talked, her hand brushed mine again, this time lingering a little longer. I didn't pull away. She didn't either. It was the simplest of gestures, but it felt monumental, as though everything that had happened up to this point had led us here. But with every moment of connection, there was the sting of guilt. Guilt that I hadn't been honest with her. Guilt that I was allowing myself to get this close, to let my walls slip. Guilt that I was feeling something for her that I knew wasn't just friendship. It was confusing, intoxicating, and terrifying all at once. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to walk away from my teat. As the night wore on, the noise of the bar seemed to fade into the background, the world narrowing down to just the two of us, standing at the edge of something undefined. I wanted to lean in closer, to close the gap between us, but something held me back. I wasn't sure if it was fear or hesitation, but I didn't have the courage to close that distance just yet. Her eyes met mine then, and for a brief second, everything else stopped. There was no more pretense, no more games. There was just her and me, and the silent acknowledgement that whatever this was, it had only just begun. The evening had taken on a new edge, the bar's soft lighting casting long shadows across the room. I could feel it now, the pull between us, stronger than before, undeniable. Every glance we exchanged, every brush of our hands, seemed to vibrate with a quiet intensity, as though the moment had arrived where we couldn't pretend anymore. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, the air between us thick with unspoken words, with things we hadn't said, things I didn't know if I was ready to confront. But I could feel it, the tension building, curling around us, tightening like a knot I couldn't undo. "You're quiet," she said, her voice light, but there was an undercurrent of something else, something deeper in her tone. I looked at her, really looked at her, noticing the way her eyes held mine, soft, but searching, like she was waiting for me to say something, to make a choice. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, louder than the noise of the bar, louder than anything else. "I don't know what this is. I admit it," the words slipping out before I could stop them. It wasn't just the drink talking, wasn't just the late hour. It was the truth, raw and vulnerable. "I don't know what we're doing here, but—" My voice trailed off, and I hated how unsure I sounded, how much of a mess I felt inside. I had spent so long pretending that I could control everything, that I could stay detached, safe. But with her, I wasn't sure anymore. I wasn't sure I even wanted to be. She didn't pull away, didn't seem put off by my uncertainty. Instead, her gaze softened, the faintest smile touching her lips. "I don't know either," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "But I know that I can't stop thinking about you." It was like a spark had been struck in the air between us, the words hanging in the space with an almost tangible weight. The rawness of what she'd just said hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't a casual comment. It wasn't a throwaway line. It was her truth, laid bare, and for the first time, I realized that maybe I didn't have to be afraid of mine, that I found myself leaning closer, drawn to her in a way that felt almost inevitable. My heart raced, my breath catching in my chest. The space between us shrank, my body betraying me as it moved instinctively toward hers. Her eyes flickered to my lips, a brief moment of hesitation before she looked back up at me, her gaze searching mine for something, permission, maybe, or an answer to the question neither of us had voiced yet. I. I don't know if I can do this, I whispered, the confession leaving my lips before I could take it back. There was so much fear in that sentence, so much vulnerability. I didn't know if I was ready for this, ready for what this could mean for us. But then she was there, closer than I thought possible, her breath warm against my skin. Her hand, tentative at first, brushed the side of my face, sending a shiver down my spine. It was a simple touch, but it made everything else disappear. It made me forget about the confusion, the fear. You don't have to be ready, she murmured, her voice like a gentle promise. You don't have to have it all figured out. Just, she paused, her thumb tracing the curve of my jaw, and I could feel the heat of her touch. Just let me in, just for a moment. Let me show you that you're not alone. The words felt like a dare, a challenge, but also an invitation, one that felt like it had been waiting for me, just out of reach. I swallowed hard, my mind racing, my heart pounding. I was scared, I was terrified, but there was something about her, about the way she made me feel seen, made me feel like maybe I didn't have to hide anymore. Maybe I didn't have to be alone. And then she kissed me. It wasn't a dramatic gesture, nothing grand or theatrical. It was a simple meeting of lips, soft and tentative at first, as though we were both testing the waters, unsure of how far we could go, unsure of what we were both willing to risk. But the moment our lips touched, everything else melted away. The world around us seemed to disappear. There was only the feeling of her, warm, alive, electric, and me, caught in the current of something I wasn't sure how to name. I kissed her back, unable to stop myself, as if everything in me had been waiting for this, for the chance to surrender to whatever this was between us. Her lips were gentle but insistent, as though she were trying to communicate something more with her touch, something deeper that words couldn't express. I felt her hand slide to the back of my neck, pulling me closer, and I responded, leaning into her, deepening the kiss. My breath caught in my throat, my heart racing as my body reacted to hers. I could feel the warmth of her skin, the softness of her body pressed against mine, and it was intoxicating, overwhelming. But even in the intensity of the kiss, there was still a voice inside me, a reminder of the things I wasn't ready to face, the consequences of letting myself feel too much, letting myself want something I hadn't planned for. When we finally pulled away, it was like breaking the surface of water after holding my breath for too long. My chest heaved, and my hands shook slightly as I tried to steady myself, to gather the fragments of what had just happened. She looked at me, her eyes wide and searching, as if she was waiting for me to say something, to react, to give her an answer. I began, but the words stuck in my throat. What could I say? How could I explain this whirlwind of emotions, the confusion and longing, the need for something I didn't know if I could have? I don't know if I'm ready, I whispered, though my voice was barely audible, even to myself. The fear was still there, still clinging to me, but it was mingled with something else now. Something like longing, something like hope. She didn't pull away, didn't get up and walk out. Instead, she simply reached for my hand, her fingers warm and steady in mine. We don't have to figure it all out tonight, she said softly, her voice full of understanding. But we can take this moment for what it is, for what it could be. There it was again, the invitation, the quiet promise. And in that moment, I knew she was right. We didn't have to have all the answers. We didn't have to know what would come next. But I also knew that I couldn't walk away from this. Not from her. Not now. And so, we stayed there, in the dim glow of the bar, the silence between us filled with the unspoken possibilities of what might come next. The kiss had changed everything, and yet nothing had changed at all. We were still here, together, caught in the pull of something neither of us fully understood, but neither of us was willing to let go. The days that followed felt like a blur, a haze of emotions that I couldn't quite navigate. The kiss lingered in my mind, every detail etched into my memory, and yet, as much as I tried to replay it, as much as I tried to hold on to that moment, the consequences of what had happened began to settle around me like a heavy fog, thick and suffocating. I found myself replaying our last words over and over. "We don't have to figure it all out tonight." Her voice still echoed in my head, and for the first time, I wondered if it was her words or her presence that had made me feel like I was finally breathing again. But the longer I sat with it, the more I realized I couldn't ignore the reality of what had just happened. I couldn't pretend that it was just a passing moment, a fleeting connection. It wasn't. What we shared, what we felt, was something deeper, something that I couldn't brush off as easily as I wanted to. The guilt hit first. I wasn't sure what I was guilty about, the kiss itself, or what it meant about me. It wasn't just the physical act. It was the emotions it stirred, the parts of me that I had buried so deep, now forced to the surface. I had allowed myself to get too close. I had let my guard down. But that wasn't the worst part. IT was the realization that what I'd done wasn't just a betrayal of my own rules, it was a betrayal of someone else. The person who had been a constant in my life, who had never once questioned me, who had never asked for more than I was willing to give. When I walked through the door of my apartment that evening, everything felt wrong. The light in the living room was dim, just the way I'd left it, but it felt too still, too quiet. My partner, Jess, was sitting on a couch, her laptop open in front of her, but her attention was elsewhere, her brow furrowed as though she could sense the shift in me before I had even spoken. "You okay?" she asked, her voice soft, but the concern in it was unmistakable. I froze at the entrance, unsure of how to respond. I was caught between wanting to lie to her, to protect her from the truth of what had happened, and wanting to confess it all, spill it out in one breath, and hope she'd somehow understand. "Yeah," I said, forcing the words out, trying to sound convincing. But even I could hear the lie in it. Just a long day at work. She didn't look convinced, but she didn't push either. Instead, she glanced back down at her laptop, though her body was tense, her shoulders stiff. Jess had always been able to read me, could always tell when something was off, even when I tried to hide it. But for now, she seemed content to let it be. I sat down on the other end of the couch, my eyes avoiding hers. I knew she wasn't buying it, but the silence between us stretched on, thick and heavy. It wasn't long before the guilt I had been carrying started to settle into my chest, suffocating me. How could I go on pretending that nothing had happened? How could I ignore the fact that something inside me had shifted, something that was never going to go back to how it had been before? The next day, things were still unresolved between us. I couldn't shake the feeling of her eyes on me, watching me like I was a puzzle she couldn't figure out. Something was broken, and neither of us knew how to fix it. I kept my distance, avoiding any real conversation, hoping that the tension would dissipate, but it only grew stronger. Every time our eyes met, I could feel the weight of the lie hanging in the air between us. But then, a few days later, I ran into her again. I didn't expect to see her at the cafe, but there she was, sitting by the window, the same easy smile on her lips, as if nothing had changed. Her presence made my heart flutter, even as the guilt churned in my stomach. "You've been avoiding me," she said, a playful lilt to her voice, but her eyes held something else, something sharper, something that made my heart skip a beat. "I get it, though. You've been busy, but I miss you." The words should have been comforting, but instead, they made my chest tighten. How could I tell her that I wasn't sure I could still be the same person she thought I was? How could I tell her that the person I was when I walked out of the cafe that night was not the same person I was when I walked back into our apartment? But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I offered a small smile, trying to hide the storm inside me. "I've just been caught up with work," I said, the lie slipping easily from my lips. But this time, it didn't feel like it was just for her. It felt like a lie I was telling myself. "You always say that," she said, but her voice softened. "Look, I know things have been a little off between us lately. I know I haven't been around as much. But if you ever want to talk, I'm here, okay? You don't have to carry it all on your own." Her words were kind, and I wanted to believe them, but something inside me recoiled at the thought of confiding in her, of being that vulnerable. The truth was, I didn't know if I was even the same person anymore, and that scared me more than anything. Later that night, I found myself standing outside her apartment. I hadn't planned on it, hadn't intended to confront her, but the guilt, the turmoil inside me, had gotten to a point where I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know. I needed to hear it from her, to understand what she thought of me, what this was between us now. When she opened the door, her face softened, and there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Relief? Worry? Maybe both. "You came," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I nodded, feeling my heart race. I was scared of what I might say, but even more terrified of what would happen if I didn't speak at all. "I need to tell you something," I began, but my voice faltered, and for a moment, the words caught in my throat. Eh? "I've been seeing someone else." The silence that followed felt like an eternity. She didn't speak at first, just looked at me, her eyes searching my face for some kind of answer, some explanation that made sense of what I had just said. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet, but there was no mistaking the hurt in it. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, the question hanging in the air like a weight I couldn't escape. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. What could I say? How could I explain what had happened? How could I explain the things I had felt for her, and for her? The woman who had changed everything for me, who had made me question everything I thought I knew about myself. I, I don't know, I whispered. "I didn't want to hurt you, but I think I've already done that." She stared at me for a long moment, as if trying to process the weight of my confession. Then, finally, she let out a small, bitter laugh. "Of course you didn't," she said softly, her voice tinged with both sadness and something else, something like resignation. "You never really let anyone in. But I guess I was just another one of your walls, wasn't I?" The words hit me like a physical blow. I had never meant to hurt her, never meant to make her feel like that, but I had. I had hurt her with my silence, my distance, and now it was too late to take any of it back. I never wanted to be that person. I said, my voice cracking. "I never wanted to be the one who let you down." She shook her head slowly, a sad smile tugging at her lips. "Well, you are. But don't worry. I'm not going to make you choose. I'm done waiting for you to figure things out." And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the hallway, utterly alone, the weight of my choices pressing down on me. Everything I had built, everything I had tried to hold on to, was falling apart, and all I could do was watch as it slipped through my fingers. The days that followed Jess's departure were the quietest I had ever experienced. My apartment, once filled with the noise of our shared life, now felt unbearably empty. The silence pressed against me, suffocating and endless. I would wake up to the scent of her perfume lingering in the air, only to realize she was no longer there. Every corner of the place seemed to hold a memory, a shadow of what could have been, what I'd lost, and what I had chosen to give up. I spent days in a fog, moving through life like a stranger to myself. Work became a distraction, a way to numb the ache that had settled in my chest. I tried to convince myself that I could simply move on, that I could walk away from it all as though nothing had truly mattered. But it didn't take long before I realized that the emotional wreckage of the last few weeks wasn't something I could easily discard. I found myself sitting at the same cafe where I'd run into her that day, the place where it all had started. The memory of her smile was still fresh in my mind, but there was something different now, something that had shifted. The coffee cup in my hands felt too warm, too heavy. I could feel the weight of my decisions pressing on me, and the reality of everything I had tried to avoid came rushing to the surface. I had hurt someone who cared about me, someone who had trusted me. And for what? A movement across the room caught my eye, and my heart skipped. It was her. How could she be here? I hadn't expected to see her again, let alone in this place, the one place that now felt like a painful reminder of what I had lost. I stood up before I could think about it, my feet moving before my brain could process the decision. The closer I got, the harder it became to breathe, the weight of the past few weeks crashing over me in waves. She looked up as I approached, her expression unreadable, guarded. There was no warmth in her eyes this time, only the remnants of what used to be. "Hi," I said, my voice small, unsure, as if I wasn't sure what I was doing or even why. She gave a small nod, her gaze flickering between me and the empty chair across from her. "Hey," she replied, her voice flat. "Didn't expect to see you here." I sat down, my hands trembling slightly. The silence between us was thick, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was just real. Raw. Both of us had been hiding behind walls for so long, pretending like the things we felt didn't matter, but now there was nothing left to hide behind. The truth was out, and there was no way to undo it. "I've been thinking a lot," I began, my voice barely a whisper, but the words felt like they had been building up inside me, just waiting for this moment to come. About everything. About what I did. About what I've been running from. She didn't say anything at first, but I could see the muscles in her jaw tighten, the way her fingers gripped her coffee cup a little too tightly. I knew she was listening, even if she wasn't ready to respond yet. "I hurt you," I continued, my voice thick with emotion. "I didn't mean to. I never wanted to. But I did. And now I have to live with that." Her eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw something other than anger or resentment. There was pain, yes, but there was also understanding. "You didn't just hurt me," she said quietly, her voice soft but firm. "You hurt yourself too. You've been running from this for so long, trying to convince yourself that you're something you're not. I don't think you even knew who you were anymore. And that's the part that's hardest to accept." The words stung, but they were true. I had been pretending for so long. Pretending I could control everything. Pretending I could live a life that didn't feel real, didn't feel like it belonged to me. But in trying to keep everyone happy, I had lost the one person who had mattered most, myself. "I know," I whispered. "And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything I did to you. For not being honest with you. For not being honest with myself." She looked down at her coffee, her lips pressed into a thin line, and I could see her struggling with her own emotions, her own pain. I wanted to reach out, to take her hand, to make her feel better, but I knew I had no right to do that. Not after everything I had put her through. "You've changed," she said finally, her voice tinged with both sadness and acceptance. "I can see it in you, but I don't know if I can trust that change. I don't know if I can be the person you need me to be after everything that's happened." I wanted to argue, to convince her that I had learned something, that I wasn't the same person I had been before. But I knew I didn't have that right anymore. I had to let her make her own choices, had to let her decide if she could ever forgive me, if we could ever find our way back to what we had. "You don't have to trust me," I said softly, my voice thick with emotion. I needed you to know that I'm sorry, that I'm working on becoming a better person. Not for anyone else, but for me." She was quiet for a long moment, her eyes focused on the swirling dark coffee in her cup. The silence stretched, and I wondered if I had just ruined the last chance I'd ever had to make things right. Finally, she looked up, meeting my gaze. "I believe you," she said, her voice quiet but sincere. "But I don't think I'm the person you need anymore. Not in the way you want me to be." And there it was, the truth of it all, the finality. I nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in, settling deep into the pit of my stomach. She was right. The person I had been running from, the person I had tried to hide from, was the very person who had pushed us to this point. And now, as painful as it was, I had to face it. Maybe we both needed to let go. I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Maybe that's the only way we'll ever heal." She nodded, the faintest smile pulling at her lips, though there was no joy in it, just acceptance. "Maybe." We sat in silence for a few moments longer, the tension between us slowly dissipating, replaced by something softer, something like understanding. We had both been broken by this, but there was also a strange peace in knowing that we had learned something important. As I stood up to leave, I felt a strange sense of closure, though it wasn't the kind I had expected. There was no grand declaration of love, no tearful goodbye, no final embrace. Just a quiet acknowledgement that sometimes letting go was the only way forward. And as I walked away from her, I realized that I wasn't running anymore. I wasn't trying to escape from myself or from what I had done. I had learned that healing didn't come from fixing everything, But from accepting the broken pieces and moving forward, even if the road ahead was uncertain, I wasn't the same person I had been when I kissed her. But I was starting to figure out who I was now, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough.